Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, and we're going to talk about Disney. And specifically, we're going to talk about the closing of the Star Wars Galactic Cruiser Hotel and how it relates to Dungeons and Dragons and why, and an exploration of why Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves and why Dungeons and Dragons don't go mainstream. All right. So let's jump into it. So basically, Dungeons and Dragons is not mainstream. It is still niche, which is really sad. Dungeons and Dragons absolutely dwarfs any OSR tabletop role-playing game and any indie tabletop role-playing game. But there are board games and there are video games that absolutely crush Dungeons and Dragons in popularity, reach, We're way behind a game about an Italian plumber made by Japanese people. It's like that, that seems like that should be a harder sell than Dungeons and Dragons. But Super Mario is way bigger than Dungeons and Dragons. That's not debatable. We just got taught that lesson very, very clearly. Right? Super Mario Brothers literally did 6 times as much business as Dungeons and Dragons. The American the global public were 6 times more interested in Super Mario Brothers than they were in Super Mario himself, and then they were in Dungeons and Dragons. That is calamitous. That is absolutely horrible. It's just so upsetting, and it's upsetting. All right, so let's talk about why the Disney Star Wars Galactic Cruiser Hotel closed. All right, I'm going to give you it closed. It just closed, and it's a big deal. It is really, this is terrible. Like, there were billions of dollars. Yeah. There's at least $1 billion invested in this, right? Like, I think the hotel itself cost like $200 million. The labor for a year. I'm very confident. This is either $1 billion to maybe $3 billion that were invested. This was huge outlay of cash on Disney's part, and it was a failure, right? And so now we need to talk about why. So I think the reason the Star Wars Galactic Cruiser Hotel failed. And by the way, if you don't know what the Galactic Cruiser Hotel is, sorry, just Google it. You'll get a sense. It was, you know what, I'll give it to you real quick. It was an immersive Star Wars experience. You would go in there for 2 to 7 days, and you would have a completely immersive Star Wars experience. The hotel was like a casino. It had no windows, right? And once you were inside, everyone was in character as a Star Wars character. Even the hotel guests were Star Wars characters, and every single thing you saw was either a Star Wars object of some type. It was a completely immersive experience. All right. Now, why did it fail? Here's why. In my humble opinion, the reason the Star Wars Galactic Cruiser Hotel failed is Americans fear, and this was in America, right? Americans fear immersion. Yeah, you're like, what? Yeah. Okay, let me put the evidence in front of you. No one in the table, no one in the gaming space is more reviled than LARPers, right? Like, LARPers are the ones who are deepest into immersion, and yet they have caught insults from every single possible corner, right? Like, they are utterly insulted and laughed at and mocked. Even more, if, in the 80s, if you played tabletop role-playing games, there's a good chance somebody tried to knock your books out of your hands, right? Like, and you would hear nerd stuff. We still hear nerd stuff. People still refer to Dungeons and Dragons as nerd stuff, right? And LARPers are way farther down the plank, right? Way farther down the plank, right? And so the reality is, people really abhor. They fear that they don't abhor. They fear immersion, right? And this prompts a very interesting discussion, right? Should they? We have been skipping conversations for Dungeons and Dragons for a long time because people aren't listening to me, right? So what do we tell people? Oh, it's just fun. It's just cutting goblins in half. It's nothing. It's a game, right? And we've reached a point where that's not truthful. We know that isn't truthful, right? In my humble opinion, that's not truthful. But there is mounting evidence that that's not truthful. Let me ask you this, right? We just in Tasha's was the first time, but Dungeons and Dragons officially brought safety tools in. Safety tools, right? Now, if this is do you think Candyland has safety tools? It doesn't, right? Candyland does not have safety tools, right? Nobody needs to have, a session to get everybody's trauma points before you play Candyland, right? That's a game. Board games do not have safety tools. Board games do not have session zeros, right? Because they're games, right? Like, this is the point. Right? If we've reached a point where officially in Dungeons and Dragons, we're having safety tools and session zero preparation sessions saying we need to determine your trauma points, right? Like, we are way out, right? Like, and this is the point. There are very needed discussions that we have not been having that are needed. We need these discussions, right? And we're not having them. And so, okay, you want to pretend that Dungeons and Dragons is just some game, right? About cutting goblins in half? You can die. You can have a person show up day one, session one, and they go through death, right? They take on a new identity, then they experience death in minute 40. Yeah, that can happen, right? You see where I'm going? And this is the point, right? I think people have legitimate reasons to fear immersion, right? But at that point, right, and you're like, well, what could they, what would anybody have to fear at Star Wars, right? Now, certainly in the Star Wars Galactic Cruiser Hotel, they certainly didn't have to fear dying, right? But they did have to fear embarrassment. They had to fear being wrong. They had to fear breaking immersion for everyone else. Right? They had to fear not understanding, right? They had to fear, and that embarrassment thing, they could be embarrassed in front of their whole family, right? Like, immersion is real, and it is, you are taking on an identity, and we have not had this conversation, right? We really, and that's why I press so hard for people to realize what, in my humble opinion, Dungeons & Dragons truly is. It is absolutely not a game. It is a powerful tool, essentially a social chainsaw, right? And you can cut your social hand off with it. This is the point, right? If you really invest yourself into an identity in Dungeons and Dragons, and then you die, you can be wiped out for weeks or months, right? And we don't have these conversations. In fact, we used to laugh at people who had these, like, and get this, right? In the Satanic Panic, right? They were saying, this is frightening. They were not wrong at that point. They were saying, this is frightening. This is about Satan. This is about the occult. When they said this is frightening, they were right. They were right there, and we were not meeting them, and we were not having real conversations with them. And there were real people who really were getting caught up in the identities, right? And did not have all the tools they needed to parse having a second, third, having Manifold Sentience, right? If you don't know what that is, look at my playlist. And this is the point, right? We are not having these conversations. Immersion is scary, right? And that's the other thing is, we're also not rewarding innovation and courage. Our society does not reward innovation and courage. I got this news about, Star Wars Galactic Cruiser being canceled on Grace Randolph, and there were lots of people in the chat who were like, yay, boo, it was stupid. And I'm like, this wasn't stupid, man. This was a big deal, right? Like, okay, Star Wars isn't your jam. My wife is like she is she's a much bigger fan of Jane Austen's world than I am of Star Wars, right? What if there could have been a completely immersive Jane Austen hotel that she could go to right in Florida, right? And not some little bed and breakfast, but a absolutely massive multi-billion-dollar franchise like swing. Like not some jank little, Halloween LARP, but something really magnificent where technology was built for it, and had the type of technology, the type of IP control, the type of funds that Disney could bring to it, right? And so this was not, people didn't realize, that people were like, oh, some stupid, hotel where you wear a Jedi robe, that's stupid. No, we lost a huge opportunity. The failure of this means that others will not build immersive experiences like this, because if Disney couldn't make it work, who on earth possibly could, right? So now the thing is, and this is so terrible, and I'm so sorry to say this to you, but I have to tell you, there is one interesting aspect to this, and that is we have this situation where it's really interesting. Dungeons and Dragons very well may, I think Dungeons and Dragons is positioned to win because it does the work and it doesn't quit. And here's the kicker. Other people lose. Other intellectual properties lose. Other games lose. Every kumbaya, every kumbaya fool out there wants to tell you that this is not a zero-sum world. It is. It is. D&D wins when others lose, right? And people want to pretend that a rising tide floats all boats, right? But the reality is that's not quite true. There's only a certain amount of resources, right? And believe it or not, as sad as it is, the loss of this, total immersion hotel puts Dungeon Masters forward, right? Because we're still in the immersion game. We haven't quit. Disney quit, right? We didn't quit. I didn't quit. You didn't quit. Which means there are still some people out there who want full immersion, right? And that's what we strive to give them every single time we sit at the table. So this is terrible for human society and good for Dungeon Masters. I don't like it. All right? I didn't want Dungeon Masters to win at the cost of Disney, but that's what's happening, right? This is very real, and I do think we have a real situation where you have winners and losers, and I am terribly sad that this closed. Now I will say, I'm not going to tell you I'm terribly sad that this closed because I wanted to go. I don't think I'll ever be able to go to Disney, right? And the reason why is, I work very hard, and I'm very blessed to have, but my father was able to take all of his kids to Disney. I've never, every time I've looked at a Disney vacation, I'm like, we could go to Disney or buy a car, and we just don't got cheddar like that, right? And so I will tell you right now, I never expected in my lifetime that I would be able to go to Star Wars Galactic Cruiser, because I never would go without my family, and eggs are $6 a box. Are you kidding me? If in President Joe Biden's world, that ain't gonna happen. It ain't gonna happen. So I'm just sad for other people who could have had that experience, right? Certainly never would have been me. I don't have that kind of money, right? But I really think this is a massive loss for human society, and I think it really prompts the Dungeons and Dragons community. We need to start having some honest conversations about Dungeons and Dragons with society, right? Not amongst ourselves. And that's the other thing, is we are talking nonstop about Dungeons and Dragons to other Dungeons and Dragons people, and we are doing a terrible job of ambassadoring it and making it so that other people can come in. And I have seen this. I definitely think we are actively keeping people out at this point. This is very, very sad. But I do think the lesson here is the world up, the world down, DMs up. This helps Dungeon Masters. Every single word of that is my humble opinion. What's important is when I get to hear your humble opinion. When you get into the comments and send your traffic, please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.